This is Pete Kears. I'm Senior Engagement Manager with OnApproach, and our topic today is a demonstration of Deep Future Analytics CECL Strategy Software, which is the newest element of its portfolio management tool. It enables easy creation of user-selected economic and origination scenarios and generates scenario-based forecasts on any variable, segment, or vintage. The integrated solution provides real-time validation, creates documentation needed for regulators, and projects price margins with user-supplied rate sheets and economic scenarios. Our presenter today is Joseph Breeden, COO and Chief Scientist of Deep Future Analytics. Dr. Breeden brings more than 20 years of experience leading financial institutions through financial modeling, allowing clients to achieve real understanding of portfolio dynamics for retail lending. There will be a question and answer at the end of the presentation, and please feel free to ask questions via chat or the questions function during the session, and I will read these during the Q&A. Dr. Breeden, with that, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate everyone joining today. We're going to go through and discuss the software, basically how we're supporting both the CECL calculations and some of the needed outputs for reporting this information. I'm assuming that most of you, hopefully most of you, had a chance to join our previous webinar where we presented our CECL study looking at Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac data, 30-year mortgage, and implementing a range of different models under CECL to look at the pros and cons of different choices. What we'll be showing today are the ones that we chose from that. So if you didn't get a chance to join that previous webinar, we can provide the materials from that, either the webinar itself or the report behind that. For today, we'll start with the software. And this software is a cloud-based application specifically designed for portfolio forecasting, stress testing. In fact, we were finishing this software just before the CECL guidelines were announced, and as we read those guidelines, the models we had built were already CECL compliant, so it was simply a matter of adding some outputs. So this application, really what you'll see is that forecasting, stress testing, and implementing the CECL estimations are all very much the same thing. The only differences are some of the assumptions, some of the scenario elements that go into those different parts. So in the software today, you'll see a logo, Denali Federal Credit Union. Denali is a partner of the CUSO Deep Future Analytics, and they've graciously allowed us to give a demo of their actual portfolio, and the scenarios you'll see are the ones that they're really using. So this is a real case study, if you will. On the home page, there are various things you can do on the home page. It's just some summary information, but I want to bring a number to mind for you. The starting screen here is a 12-month loss forecast. That's the current standard that most people use. And if I flip this chart over, you'll see that the expected loss on a 12-month horizon for this portfolio is about $12 million. And that's mostly auto loans, some credit cards, some personal loans and lines, things like that. So that number, 12 million, is going to be good to remember later on when we get to the CECL calculations. I want to walk you through the software as we get there. As a user of the software, CECL is making great demands on all of us for what we need to implement in terms of analytics. One of the advantages of having a CUSO and providing this as a service is that we can leverage analyst skills across many organizations. So in using this software as a user, the models are already built, and I'll describe in a few minutes how those models are built. But the point is that as a user, all you have to do is focus on the scenario items. You don't have to create or manually modify the models. The models are automatic. What you have to do is think about two main things. How will my portfolio grow in the near future? And what economic scenarios do I want to consider in the near future? Now, under CECL, we assume no future originations, so the origination plan would be none. But from a portfolio forecasting perspective, we could consider a range of options, continuing last point, average of some previous period, trends, year-over-year growth. Any of these you could dial in the settings you'd like. That should be done. When you think that through, you should be thinking about the economic scenario at the same time. So a robust economic scenario might lead you to certain growth assumptions, whereas more of a severe or recession type scenario would lead you to different choices. Now, for both of these, you can download an Excel template and fill in detail what your plans might be, or a detailed economic plan for your region. But by default, we always keep the Federal Reserve Board scenarios, the DFA scenarios loaded, base, adverse, and severe. And those change about once a year, something like that. When you take the origination and the economic scenario together, we give that a name and add that to the list of active scenarios. So for Denali, here's a list of scenarios they've been working with. You can see several of them are checked at the moment. There are 6 different scenarios they're exploring. One of them has a little star, and that star means that that's the reference scenario that they'll be using for their baseline CECL calculation. It also gets remembered. We maintain a database where we archive previous forecasts. This archive of past predictions is very important in CECL as you try to explain the reasons for changes from one period to the next. So far, there's been very little emphasis on explaining these changes, but it is a requirement in the guidelines to be able to explain how you go from one estimate to another. Now, the software shows all of the available history. The data is divided between origination information, performance information, scoring, and economics. So for origination, I can look here at total origination volume for Denali. You can see some of their scenarios. They have a 6-month average, and they have no new originations as the origination scenarios. We have loan level data here. In the modeling, we actually take this modeling to each individual account. And so, for example, this is showing the origination FICO by account. You'll notice that this red area is NA, not available. And there's a lot of it. That's because for the older loans they had, they didn't capture that information. So over time, that goes away, that the newer loans replacing the old loans do have complete information. But from a modeling perspective, we have to be prepared to adapt to incomplete information, changing information availability, those sorts of things. So the models have to be pretty robust to those sorts of things. We also have economic data, and this is loading all of the consumer-related or possibly consumer-related variables from the DFA scenarios, but we actually add longer history from the FRED website. If you don't know FRED, you should. It's the Federal Reserve Economic Data Repository, so it's a bunch of free economic data. And what we're showing on the screen right now by default is the economic data for the states that Denali is active in. If I scroll down, I can actually look at any state. So if you're curious about economic conditions in another state, feel free. In addition to this, you can apply transformations. So I could take what we're looking at here, and this is currently unemployment rate. I could look at change in unemployment rate, or if I bring up house prices, house price index is more natural to look at as a change. So we could look at percentage change such as over a 12-month period. So this is showing the more recent house price data and what will happen under the scenarios going forward. And let's just zoom in on the interesting part here. So you can see previous recessions that have occurred, the most recent recession, and what's happening right now. Alaska is an interesting case because right now Oil prices are low, which makes it difficult on the economy in Alaska, Texas, New Mexico, some of these energy-driven economies. So that's just our historic data. To use that data, we need a model. And in fact, the demo right now is showing a single primary model where the next release of the software out soon will actually have a primary and a secondary. And so it's always good to have a second opinion. But for the primary model, for consumer products like auto, card, mortgage, we like to use a vintage-based approach. So this first screen is showing a vintage decomposition of the performance data, and we're looking at auto at the moment, into life cycle, environment, credit quality, and seasonality. And I said for consumer, for commercial lending, CRE, other things, there's no life cycle. Life cycle is how the risk of default changes versus the age of the loan. So for consumer products, that's very important. You can see there's a dramatic increase in risk of default until about month 20 for this portfolio, and then things start to improve. This is a 5-year loan that we're looking at, 5-year segment. There's actually some default, some increased risk after the end of term, and those are loans probably that have had some delinquency problems that have gotten extended out past the expected end of term. Now, this life cycle is coming from an age period cohort analysis. That's a kind of vintage analysis. You could get a similar result from a survival model. So these sorts of models have been around for decades. They're very well known in the literature. They're a little less known in banking, but the CECL guidelines actually talk about vintage models. There are some different ways to create vintage models, but in my opinion, really age period cohort models are a very robust standard way of doing this. And in fact, in that CECL study I mentioned when we looked at mortgage, the age period cohort vintage models performed extremely well. So there's good reason to be an optimist about these. In addition to measuring the risk versus the age of the loan, and the axis here is monthly probability of default, what you see in the other graphs are adjustments to this. So in the upper right, this is the adjustment you would need for a specific vintage. So let's look here. In January of 2009, the vintage risk, the credit quality of those loans, the measurement here is minus 0.52. That's an adjustment in terms of log odds of charge-off. So it's saying the odds of charge-off were much better for the vintages booked in 2009, and that's going to be true for most of your portfolios because when the recession hit, everyone got very conservative. So less than 0, 0 is average. 0 means no adjustment to the life cycle function. But this minus 0.5, that's like half as much loss for those vintages as an average vintage. More recently, there was a period where some riskier loans were originated here in 2014. That's how you'd read this. And in fact, that's quite a bit riskier. There's some changes going on, and so they made a bunch of policy changes. So this credit quality graph is like an early warning indicator. You'll see that it goes right up to the most recent data. As long as we have a few months of data, we can start quantifying the risk of that vintage with some large uncertainty. But this is telling us that directionally things have improved. They're back to average credit quality. And maybe that's where they want to be for their current market pricing and growth strategy. So this gives them a quick guide as to how recent originations have been performing. In the lower left, this is another index that this time is versus calendar date, and it's measuring the net impact mostly of the economy on their portfolio. So you can see back here in 2010, we call it the 2009 recession, but when it comes to losses from consumer portfolios, those are going to peak generally in 2010. So this is the economy. Then you've got the recovery. Then you've got a gradual rise at the end because of the impact of low oil prices in Alaska. there will be some other issues that can come up. This is a story related to actions taken by a temporary chief lending officer, kind of stockpiling some delinquent accounts, and eventually that had to be taken care of. So this process, this index is capturing sensitivity to the economy, but it's not explaining the economy yet. We'll get to that econometric model in a moment. And then the last graph here is seasonality versus month of the year, where there are some times where higher delinquency, lower delinquency, well, in this case, charge-off, actually. And we get these results for a range of indicators. We could also look at the attrition probabilities, the prepayment for the auto loans, that sort of thing. For economic indicators, what we do is to take economic data from that state to correlate it to what we're seeing about performance in that state. And so here, what you're seeing is that unemployment correlates quite nicely to the experience that occurred there in Alaska. And then given that economic model, here are some scenarios going forward. Under these different economic scenarios, this is what impact it might have on the portfolio. And then for vintage forecasting, we would combine this with life cycle and credit quality and so forth. The last step here is taking all this to the loan level. I should make clear that all of this analysis is giving information, but there's nothing you have to do as an analyst or as a user of the software. We just make sure that we expose everything. All of the coefficients, all of the diagnostics are revealed in the software. There's no black box. There's no hidden equations here. This is not the FICO score. We live in a world where we have to disclose these things. And so here, when we take the vintage analysis to the loan level, what we do is combine it with loan level information, the kinds of scoring factors we can use coming from that input data. This is origination scoring information. These are behavioral scoring factors. All of those get combined in order to get to the loan level forecasting, either for attrition or for account charge-off rates. Now, all of this analysis, as part of the DFA offering and the CECL offering, we run this off of a shared data pool. And I get asked a lot, with a shared data pool, how much is the pool and how much is me? Well, the first thing to realize is that almost any vendor model you buy uses a shared data pool. The FICO model is a shared data pool model, obviously. There are all sorts of models out there, so there's nothing novel or scary about having a shared data pool. But I think the real issue would be there are times when your originations don't track exactly with FICO score or LTV. There may be things that you've done which are not easily captured by those. And so in that case, what we have is the life cycle that we estimate will be from the pool, because what we have learned just in the past through hundreds of client engagements over the last 20 years is that the product life cycles are very universal. An auto loan looks like an auto loan. A credit card looks like a credit card. The same is true for economic correlations. If I'm looking at the economy in Alaska, this is going to look very similar to anyone else in Alaska. So we would view the life cycle and the economic environment as the kind of thing you do want to share. You do want to understand the product dynamics, and you want to understand economic sensitivities as well as you can, especially if your history is limited. Honestly, if you only have a few months or a few years of data, you're getting the benefit of a pool of longer history by joining in. Now, eventually, you'll also be contributing as much as everyone else, so that's fair is fair. But what really happens with the shared pool is that we take these two things and all of the quantifiable parts, but then we also include underwriting factors. In statistical terms, in technical terms, these are called dummy variables, but basically it's allowing for a client-specific credit risk measure by vintage that's going to capture when you made changes that were either unusually high risk or unusually low risk, we'll quantify those. So your credit quality is your credit quality for your portfolio. But the life cycle and the environment are shared to make them as robust as we can across the biggest data set we can get. Now, all this analysis happens automatically every month when new data comes in. I recommend that people keep an eye on the environment function here, keep an eye on their credit quality so that they know how things are trending. That is good or early warning information. But that's all you have to do on the analysis. Really, as soon as you run the forecast on the controller tab, you can come here and look at what you've got. So this first graph is showing the active accounts under these different scenarios. You can see the big difference here is whether the lower lines here are for no new originations and the upper lines are for 6-month moving average. This was a strongly growing portfolio, and they've put the brakes on a little bit. Going to take a breather, and that means that their new originations is keeping steady portfolio volume, but not going to be growing that volume in the near future. Now, the next thing to look at, of course, would be what is the charge-off looking like. And so here what we're seeing, and in fact I can zoom in on this a bit, we have different results under different scenarios. And I said you can have as many scenarios as you want. This looks a bit noisy. We've got quite a range here, but the one up on top, that's using a management design scenario, not the Federal Reserve Board scenario, but looking at their local economic conditions. They design their own severe scenario, and including some average origination volume. So that's how bad it could be under a severe recession in Alaska. The other scenarios are not as bad. You have varying degrees of economics and new origination plans. Many of these are for no new origination growth. And you can see overall there's a turning point occurring here for this portfolio that we could actually go look at these diagnostics, but what it's saying is that they are booking better quality loans recently, as we just showed, and so that's going to allow a change in the volume of charge-offs and from a blended rate. If I look at the balance loss rate, this is the range of outcome we're expecting. So obviously a severe scenario can be bad for the loss rate, but most of the others are going to show steady or improving portfolio performance. Now, what you see here, I mentioned that the forecasts are at the loan level. For security reasons, we don't let you look at the loan level data here, just the aggregate information. When you click on export loan level, that's not a download. Download is what happens next to it. I'll talk about the download report, but export means we're pushing it back to the server. It's the data originally is coming from the M360 data warehouse. Export loan level means we push it back to M360 so that it can be used in with all of your account decisioning. On every one of these tabs, you'll see a button that says Download Report, and these are automated reports that we generate that you can download, and it will collect all of the different charts that at least, let's say we have an infinite number of charts you could make because you can look at this by vintage and by segment. But let's just say a good collection across the range of variables of the kinds of charts one could make. And we also give those to you in PDF form and PNG so that you can embed those in other presentations. Actually, we try to make it easy to export everything. Any graph you see, any data you see, you can export that information. In addition to report generation, we think report generation is really important, and I will show you some examples later. But in addition to that, we think validation is key. We've been building models for a long time, and during that time, the biggest change has not been in the models, it's been in the validation of the models. I've been building vintage models for 20 years. But 20 years ago, there were no guidelines on validation, and most validation was pretty minimal. Now the time to validate a model, if you're doing it by hand, well exceeds the time to build the model. It used to be data preparation is 80% and model development is 20%. That's changed. It's more like 40, 20, 40 because validation is tough. So we try to automate it. What you're seeing here is an automatically generated in-sample validation test for charge-off accounts. You can pick any period you want, any forecast horizon you want, and run a new validation test in real time. So this is current information, not just a test that someone prepared for you 6 months or a year ago. In addition, we have loan level validation reports, looking at ROC curves, KS statistics, Gini, and so forth. You can look at variance inflation factors. All these are technical terms for analysts, but they're the kinds of things that auditors and examiners love. And we also do a sensitivity report, which actually uses the Federal Reserve Board base and severe scenarios and compares the range of outcome you can get. So if I look at house prices, unemployment rate impact on charge-off accounts, what we'll see is that the swing between base and severe scenarios for the Fed causes an increase in charge-offs for auto on average about 20% as we look across here. And so that economic sensitivity analysis, you can do that factor by factor, and that's pretty useful. Now, all of this is building up to CECL. CECL is a lifetime loss forecast with no new originations. Looking at the portfolio forecasting we were doing, we already have all those pieces. We have everything you need to know in order to run this out for the full lifetime. So for us, CECL was simply saying, let's run a scenario that is no new originations. It's best to do it with a base economic scenario, although you could use any one of these. And so no new originations, base economic scenarios, run for the life of the loan. And when we do that, actually what I'm showing at the moment is the change from period to period, but let me flip back to the actual CECL number for a moment. What you can see, these bars are by segment, by product. Obviously you can see in this portfolio, Alaska Auto is their most important product. If I flip this over, the total loss reserve for this portfolio is now 20 million. And you'll remember previously it was 11.8. So this is almost a factor of 2 increase in loss reserves under CECL. Now, there were early on some studies that saying that CECL would increase your loss reserves 20 to 30%. Don't worry about it. That has to be assuming certain product mix, because as we saw in the mortgage study under CECL, the average increase is going to be 3 to 4 times, something like a 400% increase in loss reserves, because simply life of loan. If you're comparing a 6-month average life for a mortgage loan versus the 24-month loss emergence period typically used for mortgage, that's your factor of 3 to 4 right there. In this case, since it's such a heavy auto portfolio, the average life of loan is about 2.5 years. Some of the other products cushion that a little bit, but instead of a 2.5 times increase, we get just a little under a 2 times increase. So CECL is very consequential for this portfolio. And in fact, depending on when we make the transition from old rules to new rules, this CECL number could change quite a lot. So all of this is getting to the number this period. When I mentioned the previous period, this is where I can say, here was the loss estimate I had last month. Since then, my portfolio has matured a little bit, which brought down my projection for losses. The new bookings showing up here, I've added some accounts. That adds a little bit more in losses. Credit quality, no immediate change in credit quality, but if I had been booking riskier loans, that would show up as an increment here. And then lastly, economic scenario, you can see that economic scenario has been dialed to be more risky in this base case. So when you add up those pieces, you get the new number. So the idea is that when you report your CECL loss estimate, you want to have a chart like this right along in that report so that you can say, here's why the number in this case got a little bit higher. Okay. Now, when you have CECL, the question is, what are you going to do about it? So if I look at my lifetime loss estimate and I say, this is a factor of 2 higher than what I had under the old rules, well, what do I want to do about that? It turns out that the credit card loss reserves actually dropped because there are a couple of different interpretations of CECL for credit cards, but one widely accepted interpretation is that you don't look beyond the current balance. And especially if you have a lot of transactors, it may only take them a month or two to pay off that balance. So that means the average life of loan for a credit card can drop quite a bit. And in fact, when we simulate life of loan for credit cards, we wind up with lower numbers. And so that's what has brought this number down from 2.5 to just under 2. What we could do is say, well, what if I change this? Let's run some scenarios of how my forecast will change based on how I change my new originations volumes. What would my new calculation be? And adding more credit card would bring that down. So that's the kind of thing we could consider. And then the last tab that we have here is for margin calculations. Here what you do is you download a template which you would enter your basic pricing parameters, the rate sheet, some expense ratios, and given that, the software will use everything we just learned from CECL in order to do a lifetime margin calculation. So CECL is lifetime loss. As soon as you add revenue forecasting, then you get a lifetime profitability. Now we call this margin, not profitability, because we don't have the complete expected expenses, but we do get a pretty good idea what's going on a relative basis. And what this is showing us is that there is a good profit potential in some of the lower risk segments, whereas in the higher risk segments it gets kind of, there's good profit potential in the high risk segments, low FICO. In the high FICO segments, the expected margin is less. So this is the kind of thing you'd want to consider when you look across the various dimensions for your pricing. Where am I getting compensated the best relative to the risk I'm taking on? And how do I want to experiment, adjust my new originations volume by segment to maximize my profitability? And you can also look at what that'll do to your losses. So this is a basic introduction to the software. I'm going to pause, see if there are any questions out there right now before I talk any further. Okay. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment. Okay. Pete, if you're with us, have you received any inquiries at this point? Okay. Well, Pete may be away from microphone for the moment. I'm going to give him a chance to come back. I don't know if anyone is able to type questions to me directly in the chat window. You may be able to, so feel free to do so if you like. In the meantime, I'm going to bring up some reports just to give you an idea of the kind of information we would put in those reports. And then I will share this screen. Stick with me a moment.
So far, we have no questions.
Okay, and here's my sharing options. I'm trying to figure out how to switch from sharing one application to the next, but I think I've got that. So I just wanted to point out that automated report generation we think is a very valuable thing, and one example of that is the decomposition report, where it goes through and explains, first of all, there's an introductory section that goes through in detail how do the models work. And of course you'll need this with any communication that happens. And given that description and the examples of how it works, then it steps through the results and shows segment by segment, product by product, what has been obtained as the modeling outputs. And so the idea is that this collection of results, of reports for the different model components, becomes the bulk of what you're going to give to auditors or examiners when you want to have this model reviewed. Okay.
Dr. Breeden, we do have one question. How much historical data does a credit union need to get a reasonable forecast?
It's a complicated question because your data exists in many different dimensions. You have the question of how many accounts do you have? How big is the portfolio? If you're modeling this yourself, we actually have some good answers based on that mortgage study. It depends on not dollar volume, but number of charge-offs. The more charge-offs you have, the better job you're going to do at making that forecast. So data density is a key issue. As a benchmark, the auto loan modeling you've seen here, that portfolio for the auto loans is on the order of 500 million in outstanding loans. And so that's a pretty good number for doing independent analysis. But you're not going to have that in all product categories most likely. And that's where the benefit of the shared data pool comes in, because then you can get a good model even if you don't have enough data just to yourself. Now, as far as history you need in terms of time, again, if you're trying to model it yourself, to get an economic correlation, you're going to need at least one economic cycle. If you pick up a book on data analysis, you'll see that all the examples provided have multiple recessions. Nobody in this industry has multiple recessions. But really, to do it yourself, you need at least one. If you're going to join the shared data pool, then really any amount of history is going to work as a starting point. But we'll archive that history, grow that information over time so that the model gets better and better. When it comes to measuring your own credit quality, your own credit risk, that's this middle graph you see in this report. The more history on those vintages you have, the better this estimate will be. Especially that early warning indicator will be better when you've got a better baseline to compare against. And then when you think about loan level modeling, this is where people may have good history, but they may not have captured all the fields. And so we actually have detailed discussions about mandatory loan level information, optional loan level information, you know, the kinds of things that are really good to have if you can get them, but you don't have to have in order to get a forecast. So, any other questions?
There's a question here. What challenges has Denali encountered in using a tool like DFA? I think you mentioned a little bit about data that may or may not be available, that type of thing. And any other types of challenges in adopting this kind of tool?
I think in the past, it'll be no surprise that there is education to be done. And auditors and examiners, especially for credit unions, haven't always been up to date on these modeling techniques. I said that vintage modeling I've been doing for 20 years, and larger institutions have been doing that kind of modeling for that long. If you look at the CCAR and DFAST models, those institutions are very advanced compared to what a lot of credit unions have been using for their loss forecasting. So basically, in order to audit or examine CECL models, the auditors and examiners will have to learn a lot more about modeling. And so that's why we really emphasize documentation, the validation tests and the detailed documentation. The CECL study we did, we are putting out as much information as we can because nobody should accept a less effective, less accurate model simply because they think it'll get by examiners more easily. We need to use the models that are appropriate for our portfolios. And the examiners know this. They are getting educated. They are going to have to educate field staff and auditors and all that. So it's a process, but we have time. We build these models now, and in fact, when we say we have time, what we mean is if you act now, you will have time. The goal is implement something like this, do it so that you have at least a year of parallel running with your current loss reserves so that during that year you're also educating your auditors and examiners on what these results look like and how to use them. As far as internal use, I wouldn't necessarily say challenges. I think the Denali team has been very effective at internalizing it. I think it's been more the opposite, that the more they study these outputs, the more they look at the diagnostics that are coming from the models, the more aha moments they have, the insights they get, and that's how they decide to manage their portfolio better. So over time, the more you learn about the models, the more you can use these models to drive the business.
Another question. The questioner says, I have heard that DFA is in partnership with JHA ProfitStar's CECL solution. Could you speak to this ProfitStar solution?
Yes. So we do have these different partnerships, and the partnership we have with OnApproach, who's sponsoring this, is this data feed into the CECL portfolio strategy tool. The partnership we have with Jack Henry, with ProfitStars, is feeding specifically the CECL loss estimate. So it's not the full portfolio strategy suite. Instead, it's specifically focused on what is your CECL estimate. And of course, in the ProfitStars universe, they're going to focus on how you use that for budgeting, ALM, those sorts of things. So it's the Jack Henry solution is a subset of what I'm demonstrating for you here, but it's actually the same set of models. It's the same model quality.
Another question. It appears that that this has been designed to meet regulators' needs. Will multiple models be run in conjunction to the preferred automatically? Let me make sure I got that whole question.
Okay, I think I get it.
Okay.
And I do want to make a point on multiple models. If you are given an option, let's put it this way, in the CECL guidelines, they list a lot of models. And in fact, I have to give you my personal professional opinion. I think that list is not very well formed. Some of what's being called a model is not really a model. Some major models are not listed there. It's meant to be, you could consider these, and they're using terms that they find in practice out in the industry, but it's not a complete list, and it's not really a coherent list, to be honest. So I know that some people look at that and say, well, I'll just implement all of them, and or as a vendor, I think as a vendor, what you don't want me to do is just say, I'll implement all of those models, and you can choose. If I tell you, the user, you can choose, that means you need an analyst right away who's going to be able to run the kinds of tests necessary to decide which one to choose. You're going to have to do your own validation, your own documentation, because of that large universe. So our philosophy is we have trained analysts, use us, leverage that skill set instead of relearning it on your own. And so what we are trying to offer is we've been through that. We've implemented all of the CECL models and other models. You can see the example of that in our CECL study. We studied those and we said with this kind of data, with these kind of products, here are the best models to call your primary model. And we'll give you a good secondary model to get a second opinion. And for both of those, they'll be validated, documented, ready to hand to an auditor or examiner, so you don't have to do that. So we don't want to put the burden on you to pick the model yourself. We want to make it so that you can just use the models.
Question, can you tell us how many credit unions data is included in the results? Also, the average vintage starting date of their data?
Average vintage starting date is a good question. I'm starting with that because that got my attention. It's going to depend on the product. We would say, give us all the information. In other words, we need all your active accounts no matter how old the vintage is. So for line of credit products, you will find some very old vintages in there. So really the average vintage date is going to be dependent on the life of the loans, how quickly they pay off. So it's a little bit of a nuanced answer, but for most of our clients, we're getting all the old vintages. How much history is more uneven across clients. In terms of number of clients, that's growing very rapidly, as you would guess, because a lot of people are adopting CECL solutions. At this point, I'll just say it's in the dozens of clients because I don't want to speak too precisely. I haven't checked with sales most recently. But I do want to point out that we also bring in other information. So we're also bringing in some time series information from the industry so that we can see longer histories in some of these states. And for the mortgage area, we have Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac data. So that's actually $2 trillion worth of mortgages that we can put behind this analysis. So it's hard to get better than that. So we're collecting data from as many sources as we can. Short answer.
Okay, any additional questions for Dr. Breeden?
Okay, well, I appreciate everyone's time today, especially for a software demo. Usually I present research results. We like being able to provide educational information, learning. So we do have a lot of materials like that on various topics. If you don't have them, please write to us. But I appreciate you going through with us to see how we implement this and would welcome any feedback because, of course, we're continuing to evolve our implementations here. And honestly, if we get new guidance from auditors or examiners about what they want to see, then we'll adapt. That's what we do in this industry. So thank you all, and I hope to hear from you soon.
Thanks, Dr. Breeden. I hope you enjoyed today's session. As a follow-up email, we'll send to field any additional questions you may have, and we can send out the answers to those. Also, a link to the previous presentation was included in the chat, so please check your chat for that. And I'd also like to thank my colleague Mark Ports for handling the behind-the-scenes work for the webinar. Again, thanks for your participation in today's presentation. Goodbye.